underway for Tankfest 2021. We have the privilege of Alex Scott, who's going to be in the main arena. He is from the History in the Making team, and you're going to see an exciting mock battle featuring infantry, vehicles and tanks from the early part of World War II, and Alex will be your expert. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning, one and all. Hope you can hear me. So we're going to demonstrate a battle, a skirmish, from the early part of World War II. Not very early in the war because the Americans were involved, but while the Germans are still managing to stay ahead of the game and are still using blitzkrieg, and we're going to demonstrate how that works a little. So if you'll bear with us a moment while we're setting up, there is a half-track being backed into one of the arena entrances to collect an anti-tank gun, and we have a reconnaissance patrol in the arena. So it will be a moment or two before we start, I think. Now I've got a rough idea of what's going on, but I'm going to talk about what's in front of me because no plane survives contact, and I'm fully expecting these to come unravelled in some way or form at some point. I think the Germans must be expecting not to meet the armoured car will be on point. So no, these fellas are not expecting much resistance. But what we have here is a fast-moving reconnaissance unit who are Battle of France, and through the early years of the war, that the Germans had a much more cohesive way of operating in the field. And that was a thing that had to be learned before the battles in Normandy and before the later part of the war when the Allies gained the upper hand. So we've still got a Poole in the front, so they're obviously feeling brave. I don't know what we're going to be up against. They've obviously got wind that the Germans are in the area. So they're moving slowly. And a half-track with a Maxim gun on top. So that's 4 50 calibre machine guns. That's quite a lot of firepower. You wouldn't want to be on the wrong end of it. But the little Stuart is quite lightly armoured, called by the British a honey because they had Cadillac engines in the back, and they drove very much like a motor car, unlike a tank with a radial engine, which can be quite a handful because they have a flat torque curve. The little Stuart drove very much like a motor car with an automotive torque curve. So we've got an American infantry unit, nicely spaced out, some of them anyway. And the Germans are just playing a watching game, which is what a recce unit would do. Count numbers, count weapons, and they're reporting back all the time because they're obviously in radio contact with their upper echelons. So very much a waiting game at the moment. Not sure if... And the Americans have only just realised what's going on. You hear the high sergeant rate of the MG-42. Much higher than anything that the Allied armies had at the time. Half-track appears to be burning nicely. Now I should imagine the Germans right now are calling for support because on the face of it they look fairly outnumbered. But the thing about Blitzkrieg was that they could call in for air support, they could call in for long-range artillery. I hope they can see more of the targets they're shooting at, because you can't see the targets at the moment. What I do know is there's a half track coming in with an anti-tank gun, so they've obviously got a plan for that and the skewer. And the German crew unhitching their anti-tank gun, getting ready to manhandle it into position. Takes a little while to set up these things. It's still probably quicker than calling in air support. And the MG-42 still keeping the Americans' heads down. You really wouldn't be moving about too much without squirting away at you. Anti-tank gun getting ready to fire, and the Americans trying to sort out counter-attack, I think, and consolidate the position. So the Americans will be wondering how they can get round the outside of the Germans, see if they can outflank them. And we've got a Dingo armoured car coming into the arena with some more American infantry, so they've called in support. Are going to be outflanked in a minute if they're not very careful, so I suspect they'll be calling in some heavier support in a moment. There we go. And the anti-tank gun crew rushing to reload. I'll have a bit more idea of range now. Americans moving forward. But in that half track there's a radio. I'm almost guaranteeing he'll be asking for Stukas or long-range artillery, and that will deal with what Allied forces have got. So called in armour. This particular tank actually served the African Corps, I believe. The Germans getting a bit more confident now. Now they've got some armour behind them. They're right in front of them. I was waiting for that skewer to move. It's a bit of sitting target there. Quite a fast tank, but fairly lightly armoured. And not very heavily armed either. 137mm gun. Not really a match for a Panzer III. Oh, they've hit the Stuart already. I'm not beginning at the end of the Allies, really. Now the Americans really are going to have to pull back. They've been outflanked and outmanoeuvred, and the Germans have got all the heavy support they need now. So this is the lesson that the British Army learnt in France and the American Army learnt in Tunisia, really. Lessons in joined-up warfare that had to be absorbed before they could gain the upper hand. The Germans have been talking to each other, they've got all the support they need, and they can call it in whenever they want. He's trying to organise a party withdrawal, fire and manoeuvre, as the Germans advance. Better wish them better luck next time. Germans still moving forward. They've got the Allied unit completely on the run now. Their position is well consolidated. I don't think there's much chance of a counter-attack until the Allies have got well out of the way and they can have a rethink. Victory celebrations and so forth. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the early war battle. Thank you very much.
Suspension system developed by Tamio O'Hara. It's called a bell crank suspension system, and they put it into production. It sees action from the late 1930s onwards, and it's very successful from the point of view of the Japanese, because basically it's not fighting much other armour. The Japanese then concentrate their resources on building ships, because again, as a maritime nation, island hopping, tanks take second place in their design process. Now we brought out our M3 Stuart, a bit of a comparison. containing complete Valentine DD tank. So this is what all the Allied crews trained on before D-Day. They actually land in Sherman DD tanks. What's a DD? If you're looking at the rear of the tank, duplex drive, it can drive by its track. It's a vehicle they train on. They decide they want the Sherman as the actual vehicle for the landings, because if you look at the barrel on this Valentine, it goes over the screen, so the gun has to be rearwards when it's actually going the far east right to the end of the war. Two AEC bus engines in the back powering that vehicle. And one of the issues with British tanks early in the war is the idea of how you power them. The Americans decided to use aeroplane engines. In Britain we ended up having to tweak diesel bus engines to get enough power. So in those days we're going to see how we came up with a solution to that. Now that facility can quicker armour than anything else on the battlefield at the time. Single type turret, commander and gunner in there, driving right down the front. But larger armoured car, that becomes this Daimler armoured car. And they had problems in the sense of manufacturing space, delays. It doesn't actually go into service till about later in 41, even though it's designed just before World War II. They're almost brother and sister vehicles, the Dingo and the Daimler. They take the turret from the Tetrarch, the light tank, 2 pound a gun. Now this one's something called the M16 half-track, followed by the SDKF-7 half-track. Germany and America really went to town on half-tracks in the 30s. They like the experimental. Let's try and make vehicles, wheels at the front, tracks at the back, and they took their ideas from the French Crossley Congress. Congress used to work at one point for the Tsar. He was looking at putting track vehicles together. Lots of countries like the idea of them for their off-road mobility. 16 is the model with those 4 .50 caliber Brownings in the back, used for anti-aircraft use. By the time they're landed in Normandy, there's not much of a Luftwaffe left as a threat, so they tended to be used on ground targets as well. And they saw service right into the Korean War. Lots of countries use them much longer afterwards. Now the SDKF-7, privately owned by Bruce Crompton in his collection. People say, where do these things come from? That one, after the war, there was a pair of them being used. And I know you're all going to fall asleep if I start trying to explain what all these different abbreviations are, but basically, M4 is the Sherman tank. A1 means it's got a cast hull. Look at that rounded hull. Cast metal as opposed to welded. And this one's got the classic radial in the back. Doesn't that sound good? Now, what the Americans do, they realise they are going to be, as Roosevelt said, radial engines like this are wanted by the US Air Force. So they're going to have to find other ways of powering these tanks. Hence, M4 A2, A3, etc. If you look at the other models, it's really about different engines that are being powering them. This is the right radial. The next vehicle that's coming on, if I can see it in the distance there, I think is our Sherman from the Fury, and that engine is a twin diesel in the back. So a variety of engines were used, hence those different names. And again, if you get very nerdy, if there's a brackets and it says 76 after the name of the tank, that means it's got a 76mm gun on it, as opposed to the 75mm gun that was on those earlier original Shermans. Now the Sherman, again, whatever people tell you about it, if they start criticising it, look them in the eye and say, look, that is a tank that pretty much saved the West. It is a brilliantly simple design, meant for a specification, 30 tons. They're going to have to send it around the world. There wasn't Royal Land Fighters in America. They knew these tanks were going to have to cross the Atlantic or cross the Pacific to see action. So 30 tons is what's needed. The Sherman, like the M4A1, those Shermans were used by British forces in the Battle of Alamein in October 42, and we loved them. They were reliable. You could fix them relatively easily. Reliability, major issue for early British tanks. But they could fix these very well, easily, and there was a lot of them. That was the other great thing. So it gave us breathing space. Don't forget, in Britain, we're trying to build fighters, bombers, we've got a navy. You know, we need all the help we can get to maintain our campaigns around the world. Now, with the Sherman, they're arriving in numbers, 75mm gun, the armour thickness on those early Shermans, that was easily a match for the Germans at the time. What retrospectively doesn't seem such a good idea, the Americans quite quickly thought that would be good enough to last the war. And it was only later that they realised, well, hang on a second, when the Panther comes along, when vehicles like the Tiger are out there, we're going to need a more powerful gun. And it's only belatedly did they start getting, just before D-Day, tanks, units equipped with this tank, with a 76mm gun on it, and they don't see action actually because the crews didn't like the idea of changing just before they went over to Normandy, so they don't see action until a little bit later in the Normandy campaign. But what you've got there is a millimetre wider hole at the end of the barrel, so 76mm, but a much longer gun that can take a larger cartridge case and therefore more velocity behind the round that flies out the end. And don't forget, the Americans originally see the Sherman as really an exploited, like a British cruiser tank, going through the gap, doing its business behind the lines. If it met an enemy tank, so be it, we might have to take them on, but actually for fighting enemy tanks, we've come up with the idea of the tank destroyer. Vehicles like the M10, later the Hellcat. It was seen as a theory not to work in combat, and retrospectively, very quickly, the Americans realised, hang on a second, we're going to have to do something about it. They pushed the Pershing into operation a bit later on. So there you've got Chris Still's privately owned, lovely M4A1. You've got our tank that again is all kitted out. That's the one you saw in the Fury movie. It was a hero tank there that's on. And we're now going to see another type of Sherman, longer body. When he goes round, if you want to be a real spotter, look at the wheels. They're slightly further apart because they had to make this longer to fit yet another type of engine in. And this is the Chrysler multi-bank engine, where they get a whole load of car engines, bolt them together around a single shaft in the middle, and this is only one of 3 running Shermans with multi-banks in the world at the moment. And again, you listen to all those different engine notes, when this one goes past, it's different. As I say, longer body to fit it in, same 75mm gun on there at front, and this is the welded hull, so this one they call it M4, not the A1 bit. the arena moving at the same time. You've got the two tanks that probably won the war for the Allied forces, one in the east and one in the west. Nikolai Kostin designs the T-34, late 1930s. Russian army says no thank you, we want the KB-1. Stalin leans over, coughs politely and says you'll take the T-34. Yes, our collections, private collections, because they tend to have a number of iterations. Sometimes they were used by other armies who added bits or took bits off, changed engines, etc. But this is relatively recently have a new engine put in, but it's still one of those wartime diesel V12s that's being used there. Uses the famous suspension system designed as well by Walter Christie, and again you can see there on the side writing, patriotic writing to back the troops up. But the T-34 made, we think, probably about 70, maybe even 80,000. The Shermans about 50,000 plus other variants after that were converted. So you know these are really big numbers, and that is going to make the difference in industrial age warfare. Earlier in the war, Britain has the problem. We leave our tanks behind us at Dunkirk, lots of them in France. Churchill says to the factories, keep making what's in production now. Don't stop to do an improved model. We need tanks now. And that order was repeated, amazingly, into early 1942. The American Sherman gave Britain breathing space. So we were concentrated, Spitfires, Lancasters. We wanted to get back at Germany. We've got a navy, we've got colonies, we've got an empire. We're fighting around the world. Russia wasn't, just remember that. Russia couldn't give a monkeys about its navy, couldn't give a damn about its air force, just built tanks. Britain had to do the lot. So again, from that point of view, those American Shermans were a godsend for Britain. When we did get back to the idea of starting to create tanks, Cromwell family, and then this fellow driving around now, which is the Comet. And by now, the pressure on making those aeroplane engines for the fighters and the bombers, we've got enough capacity. So they get the famous Merlin engine, degrate it, put it in a tank, and they call it the Meteor. And that gives, for the first time, well over 600 horsepower. As well. They were hoping to put this down into the earlier Cromwell. It's a high velocity 77mm. Sometimes people call it like a distorted 17-pounder. It's not actually, it fires the same round as a 17-pounder, but it's got a different case. The case comes from the 3-inch anti-aircraft gun. Shut up for you so you can just enjoy the engine notes of this amazing selection of vehicles. just towards the end of the war, they built some of these half-tracks with a huge armoured body on, and it was a command and control point for launching V2 missiles. Of the time, because if we don't start talking soon, we'll run out and go over into lunch hour. Thanks, Ed. Thanks. So the first vehicle we've got on is designed by a company not that far away from here, down in Bovington, the Super Camp. It's got lovely little bits of newish technology from all over the place, and it was to meet a requirement for a long-range reconnaissance vehicle that was going to be used out in Afghanistan. And what we ended up with, this vehicle becomes called the Jackal. It's got a weapon station on the top that you could fit a GPMG, a 50 caliber Browning, you could put a 40mm grenade launcher on. Again, another crew member there. And the idea is, you look at it, it's got fantastic all-round visibility. So that idea of using the human eye to see what's going on around you, hence the open top. Some form of armour protection there, and a very clever suspension system. But you can tell me all about this.
Oh, okay. So the suspension system on the Jackal is quite clever. It's able to raise and lower. So it's three positions. The fully lowered position, it's all the pressures of the system. Originally it was designed by Supercat to fire from this position, so it gives it a more stable platform. And it didn't really work that way, so we normally fire it from the intermediate position as you see now. Intermediate position is what we use for cross-country. And the fully raised position then is what we do on motorway driving. Suspension is the stiffest, and travelling at 80 miles an hour down the motorway you need really stiff suspension.
And this has got a long range, hasn't it? That's the idea behind it.
Yeah, it's got a range of 800 kilometres, which is, compare that to Challenger 2 on a good day, around about 550. It feeds into that strategically mobile wheels platform.
Now they also do a sixth wheel version of this, whose name we couldn't remember the other day, but it's called a
Coyote,
we remember that now, called a Coyote, and that can act as one of those supply vehicles as well. So when these guys are heading off, if they're going on a 2-3 day mission, deep behind enemy lines, etc., or in terrain, that's the other thing, the off-road capability of this as a wheeled vehicles. What we tend to say here is tracks will get you places wheels can't go, but that difference is closing up pretty much all the time.
The few vehicles you can talk about when it drives past.
Well, I'm just mentioning that because every now and again he says shut up and listen to the vehicle, because in that case it's so quiet. It made the scimitar. Now the scimitar, part of that CVRT family of vehicles designed for British forces in the 60s. Some of the older blokes here, you might remember, you had your Scorpion Action Man tank. This was part of that family. Instead of a 76mm gun, it's got the Rardon 30mm cannon on it. Aluminium armour, fast speed, mobile for getting around the place, and that Rardon takes a bit of a punch, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. In the 30mm cannon world, the Rardon is probably one of the most accurate 30mm cannons out there. Easily capable of dealing with its threats that it needs, so its target set is usually things like BMP2s, BRDMs, etc. So it's more than capable than that. The HE round is very effective. We teach that it's like throwing a hand grenade 5 kilometres.
with a Cummins diesel engine that's in there at the moment. Still in service, went into service 1972. The Senator will probably be soldiering on for about another year for a while yet. So, next vehicle on, the big one in front of us, this is the Warrior. It was the armoured personnel carrier that was designed to replace the 432 that again is still in service, that boxy vehicle. This is a whole new ballgame though, because look, it's got the riding turret on the top, again an aluminium hull, it's speedy. Again, you've got the power pack in that gets this vehicle around the battlefield very quickly.
It was one of the benefits of the Warrior that it was so powerful that in later campaigns when we need to add extra armor to the vehicle, it didn't really bog it down and affect its mobility.
And again, this is a vehicle now going to go out of service. Service in a couple of years' time. You may have been following, there is a Warrior replacement programme, new turret, 40mm gun. Fairly recently that's been axed. We've actually got the prototype vehicle down here at the museum, and Warrior is going to be replaced by a wheeled vehicle called Bovington for Ajax. That's going to be the next big recce vehicle, and if you've read in the press, they've got problems with it at the moment. There's a problem coming in. We may be using Warrior as a reconnaissance vehicle meanwhile, because it's so fast and very agile.
Reconnaissance has changed over the last decade. It's no longer feasible to conduct reconnaissance through stealth, so we're seeing a shift towards a heavier vehicle, better protection, better firepower, and that's where Ajax comes into play.
Armour, because it's like a cage, it's thinner, it's lighter than adding blocks of, whether it's steel or nowadays reactive or laminate armours as well. That's one of the other things that you always have to think about. The bigger the weight on that vehicle, the slower it's going to get.
Coming in now, we have a Foxhound and a Mastiff. Mastiff being an MRAP, so mine resistant, ambush protected. These are very much born out of the Iraq and Afghan conflicts. The vehicle in front, the Foxhound, that's a development cycle that took 10 years. State-of-the-art vehicle. It's taken a lot of materials and engineering expertise from the Formula 1 and aerospace industry. So for example, the hull is of a monocoque construction. Not much metal in there, that's all composite materials to keep the weight down. It's a very effective, reliable patrol vehicle.
And if you look at it when it drives past, the Foxhound, that's that first smaller vehicle, it's got a V-shaped hull. And again, we used to call it mines, nowadays they call them IEDs as well, same thing. Something buried in the road that's going to blow up when you go over it, or triggered nowadays by by somebody else. That V-shaped hull you'll see on Saracen, Saladin, it's not a new idea, but the point behind it, when the blast goes off, you don't want it captured under your vehicle because it might flip you over. So if the blast goes up the side, you're going to survive, and that's very important. On the Mastiff, sacrificial boxes. It doesn't matter if they blow off, as long as the crew are okay inside the vehicle, that's all that matters. And again, you can see that bar armour, those cages around the outside of the vehicle, as well as the weapon station on top.
Sticking with the protection of the Mastiff, the wheels etc. are designed to fly off as well to keep that V-shaped hull intact. And it really does do what it says in the tin. In Afghanistan they were hitting some absolutely monstrous IEDs and the crew's just coming out slightly battered and bruised, so it really does what it says in the tin.
So crew survivability, again, it's another one of these things. You look through the history of armoured vehicles, there's some where it looked like they didn't give a monkeys about the crew. And again, we're in an age now where obviously making sure the lads come home is so important. So that idea of the protection levels on some of these vehicles, and look at the way they've grown. We all talk about miniaturisation. Now you might wonder what these
steering on, which means the rear wheels can turn as well. The idea being that a built-up area and they need to turn the vehicle around a small alley.
A system that can be stopped.
step out of the way because I know who's driving that. Yeah, I was mentioning the pushing the pendulum, we call it. There's always an action, the counter action. We develop high explosive anti-tank rounds. Later on, we develop composite armour to counter that. The tank then comes back into play. Recent years, we've had anti-tank missile systems, which are deadly for armoured vehicles. But the newer technology out there, active protection systems that can shoot down these missiles, mean that now the tank is going to be at the forefront of armoured warfare or warfare for many years to come. There's a saying as well, saying that a tank is like a tuxedo. You very rarely need a tuxedo, but when you need one, only a tuxedo will do. That's very true for the main battle tank.
So this particular Challenger 2, this is the one that comes from up the road at ATDU, the Armoured Trials and Development Unit, and basically it's got everything on it that might be put on a tank if it goes out to fight in the theatre. So it's got the Barracuda camouflage system.
Remaining undetected and getting that shot off. But it also has an added benefit. We got this issue to us while we were in Iraq, and it reduced the temperature inside the vehicle to a more sort of bearable standard, so we were grateful of that.
And there, what you've just seen as well, it puts diesel on its hot exhaust, and that creates that smoke screen. So it can fire out smoke grenades, creates a, what's it called nowadays?
Oh, it's a multi-spectral smoke grenade.
Multi-spectral smoke grenade. You can't see through with lots of different things, but it also can do that. Again, it hides you from the enemy. Simple things that are still very useful.
Yeah, it's also good for hiding, but we've also found that if we're going to put a deception in, if you put one of these on or behind a hill and run smoke generators, the enemy doesn't know how many vehicles are there, so the end up sort of taking that as a deception, so it's a good tool to have.
And the other point that we always try and make over here, when this thing goes past, you won't hear me, but think of yourself as an infantryman in a trench, and this is coming towards you. One of the things about tanks, they have a certain symbolic power as well as having that fear factor. And that's true right from the very first tank we got the right from the actually underneath it is a Challenger 1 hull where they put the Challenger 2 running gear in. They build up the superstructure. You've got a lovely dozer blade ground anchor on the front, a winch, you've got a crane on the back so you can do pack lifts, in other words the engines out of other vehicles, you can carry a spare or tow behind you a trailer with spare engines in. An impressive bit of kit, and it looks a part of it as well, doesn't it?
It is a pretty scary looking vehicle, a little bit ugly, but it's got great personality. Talk about the winch there. The winch at the front is able to pull 50 tons straight off, and if you put an extra pulley in there, it's able to lift 100 tons. It shows you the force that can pull. Once it digs its blade in, it can really pull it.
identify possible battle FUP locations and line of departure locations. Similar commander confirmed an enemy front position that marks the FUP ready for the subsequent battle group attack.
Hello, Zero, this is Foxtrot 2 to Alpha, FUP grid, Sierra Uniform 270, 570, 270, 570, over. Zero, roger, hold.
BGHQ is formulating an attack secure orders card to inform all of the battle of the enemy's strength and location, and will conduct the attack in the timing of each hour. Key to this activity will be the fire plan itself, and will prepare a fire mission in support of the attack. What you will now see is the warrior moving into the FUP. His role is to deliver the infantry as close to the enemy objective as tactically possible. The infantry dismounts from enemy fire as they rapidly advance onto the enemy objective, and then provide fire support with its own 30mm Radar cannon and its coaxial 7.62 L94 machine gun. Dismounted troops fight through the position. At this point you'll see the infantry section using fire team manoeuvre, keeping constant fire to keep the enemy's heads down as they close in on the enemy objective. The section commander will now drop off his other fire team to provide fire support to Charlie fire team and close in to clear through the position. The section commander just popped a smoke grenade there just to cover his assault in onto the enemy position. So what you are using by tank standards. Medium velocity 700mm gun. Maximum wireless somewhat 60.
Armoured vehicle. Now the Saladin, it's designed in the early 1950s. Again, it's part of a family. They make the Saracen armoured personnel carrier. In fact, Saracen gets priority because the Malayan campaign is going on, and we thought vehicles to protect the infantry would be more important. So Saladin is delayed a little bit, but it's got a 76mm low velocity gun on it. And again, when you look at that, that's the same size gun that was on that Sherman we saw earlier. So it can pack quite a bit of punch, and it can fire a number of ranges of ammunition types. So it can fire smoke, it can fire high explosive, it can fire squash head. And it was a very effective vehicle. We sold it all around the world. This vehicle, this is a multi-role Cougar. Now Cougar, again, bear with me, way back Switzerland designs a vehicle called the Piranha, and you can buy it in 6-wheeled, 8-wheeled versions. They can make it longer, shorter, very reliable, Detroit diesel in the front. And this particular version, made under license out in Kent, Canada, by General Dynamics Canada, they took the Scorpion turret and dropped it on top and call it a fire support vehicle. So it can carry some troops in the back, but also it can fire that 76mm gun in an attack. Never has to do it in anger. They have been sold on to a couple of other countries, and the Canadians very kindly, when they retired, a number of them, gave one to us here at the Tank Museum. So a multi-role vehicle, but you'll see these, what they call light armoured vehicles, labs, in use for lots of different countries. Now, another type of vehicle, the 432 armoured personnel carrier. We saw in our World War II battle that German 251 half-track. We've seen the American half-track. This is a is the French company that puts it together. 13 tons. Starts at 12, moves up to 13 tons. And they start by putting a lighter gun on this, and really what you're looking at is like a mobile gun platform. It's not heavily armoured, but they've managed to they started off with a 70 grade on it. I think they actually come all the way to the Dominican Republic. The problem with those, the Israelis found out, they had them in service at the end of the 60s. As soon as they tried to take on a proper tank coming the other way, they came a cropper. And again, in the 1967 war, the Israelis immediately realised this was not a vehicle you should be trying to use on tank-and-tank engagement, because they suffered badly and they dropped them out of service very, very quickly.